Welcome back to Wyrd Wessex. I'm Andy.
And I'm Craig.
Today we are joined by Alex Stevenson. Alex just completed an in-depth academic study focusing on a really unique aspect of cryptozoology, particularly through the lens of Ivan T. Sanderson's work. So, Alex, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to the show.
Your dissertation, Alex, the title alone is enough to get our brains buzzing. The Missing Poetics of Footprints in Mid-20th Century American Cryptozoological Writing. Before we dive too deep, though, could you give us sort of the elevator pitch?
Yeah, I'd really love to. So reading through contemporary literary theory from the 50s to 60s, you'll find a real interest in something called the trace. Folk like Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida are really intrigued that language seems to be all about missingness. What's not there, what's broken, what's been left behind that's something that perhaps used to be. And in Derrida's Of Grammatology, he reframes this missingness as actually what language is all about. Not about what was there before, what left this trace, but the trace itself. And in Bigfoot stories from the 50s, 60s, 70s, you would also find an interest in the trace, a much more embodied trace. Bigfoot leaves behind massive footprints, and sort of in the same way as the contemporary literary theory, the authors of Bigfoot stories, those who've seen him and those who are scientifically interested in him, root their arguments in the trace, try and understand it as something that's perhaps more concrete than we might otherwise imagine, to figure out what this beast is. So I discovered sort of very similar patterns of thought happening between the literary theorists and the Bigfoot authors, let's say, as they try and piece together this mystery. So that was my dissertation. It was trying to understand stories about Bigfoot, narratives, encounters with him as literary pieces in their own right, not trying to kind of distinguish them from stories that are kind of true stories. My dissertation is not really about that, but trying to understand whether true or not, these stories can still function as literary pieces. It was real fun. I had a lovely time reading through lots of this stuff.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, I mean, you've basically answered my next question about what you're exploring, so that thank you for that. Sort of anticipated that one, so that's brilliant. So Ivan T. Sanderson is clearly sort of quite a pivotal figure in the history of cryptozoology, you know, sort of people in the father of, or one of the fathers of cryptozoology. What specifically drew you to him as a subject for your academic focus on the footprints?
He seemed a lot more explosive than Bernard Hooverman's ever was, in a way that I found quite lively and imaginative. Sanderson seemed a lot more alive to, I don't know, these stories being outrageous than it seemed Hooverman in his writing does. Hooverman is very much the kind of traditional scientist in this field. If those two, Sanderson and Hooverman, are the fathers of cryptozoology, then it seems that Sanderson is a lot less concerned with seeming reputable, whereas Hooverman is quite the other way around. They both have a really key part to play in this story, from the sort of late 40s to the early 70s, really, and then Hooverman's a little longer because he outlived Sanderson by quite some time. But no, I was attracted to how fiery Sanderson's prose was. He realised, I think, perhaps a little more than Hooverman's did, that his stuff would be read by the general population, let's say, who loved kind of reading magazine prose, reading gossip articles, and his writing often reads very similar to kind of light fiction, while still trying to elaborate this Bigfoot phenomenon.
I guess, does that make it more approachable, kind of, to the general populace?
That's it, isn't it? It's not as quite as prohibitive, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think I tend to agree with that. Most of his, most of what makes up his Abominable Snowman legend come to life, which is this big kind of thesis, over 400 pages. Everything he's ever thought about Bigfoot is in that. Most of that is sort of derived from shorter magazine articles yeah, that were found in places like True Magazine, that sort of function as like man's magazines in the 60s. Yeah, so you'd find Sanderson articles of Bigfoot next to like cartoons of women without much clothes on, sort of thing. That was like the 60s niche that Sanderson. And then perhaps in an attempt to dignify some of the seriousness of what he was talking about, he publishes this extended work. So yeah, it begins in light fiction, but perhaps tends towards something that's aiming towards a higher truth, let's say, than perhaps it might have done at the beginning.
So, I mean, it's probably a good point before we kind of keep going into your dissertation itself. Maybe you could explain a bit more about exactly who Sanderson was.
Yeah, I'd love to. So he was a British guy. He was educated at the University of Cambridge, and he became a naturalized citizen of the US in the 50s. I couldn't quite find when. There's really not that much information online about Ivan T. Sanderson. Fortunately, the American Philosophical Society have released some of his papers. So you get an insight of some of Sanderson's communications with his publishing team, to get perhaps a slightly truer image of the man. Yeah, he was married at least twice, by all estimates. His wife at least has two names, so I presume he was married twice. But as I say, it's slightly bare. There's really not much on him. He began sort of as, let's say, the last of the generation of British explorers in the 30s till early 40s. And then he found that he could make a lot more money by publishing some of his explorations in neat kind of natural writing. And it's easy reading. People really seem to like it, and he sold much. And then he became more and more interested in the work of Charles Fort, his Fortiana, his sort of wanting to investigate more and more of the unexplained. And that leads him towards the Abominable Snowman, which is the sort of chief piece of his Fortiana. Yeah, a strange man, a remarkably strange man. And I was chatting with Eric Nelson, who you've had on the show, and he was saying that Sanderson seems like one of those men who's lived many lives, and I think that's certainly true of Sanderson too. Beginning life at sort of educationally at Cambridge, and then going off to all the four corners of the globe as an explorer, publishing his work, and then finding that he can make some money in the world of the unexplained. Certainly always looking to make a buck, but that doesn't sort of deteriorate or diminish how thought-provoking some of his work is, in the misses scientific orthodoxy in his time.
Yeah, I mean,
in my head, I've got. Sorry, go on.
No, you crack on. You crack on.
I just say in my head, I've just got images of like the modern day Sanderson is Brian Blessed, right?
I think they'd have got on, you know.
As a modern cryptid, I did it again. Cryptic. I keep saying cryptid. Cryptid explorer with Brian Blessed is like punching polar bears and exploring the planet.
I am the Yeti. Oh, I mean, sort of interesting. You mentioned about like the last of the generations of like those British explorers, because I guess that was kind of the final form it took once once we'd flown planes over the interior of Guinea and found like the tribes on the plateau there, once we'd sort of delved into like the unreached bits of Africa, which obviously had been reached, just not by white Europeans as much, but sort of once you've explored those places, then I guess cryptozoology is that sort of final frontier of it, isn't it?
It certainly seemed that way for Sanderson. It's probably important to recognise that he seemed to be very aware of what his image was, particularly for an American audience. And there's a difference between the way he speaks in British interviews and the way he speaks with Americans.
He knew how to play his audience.
Yeah, his RP is ramped up when he speaks on American TV. So he understood himself as well. He certainly wanted to appeal to this sense of a British explorer. And you're right; it seems like very much for him to be this final frontier. If we've seen every land on Earth, what's left? And he finds it, and real success in cryptozoology with Bigfoot and other such creatures.
I mean, there was that chap that found the last of the Japanese holdouts after World War II, and otherwise his words, he said, "I wanted to find this specific soldier whose name escapes me.
Yeah.
I wanted to see a panda, and I want to find the Yeti." Those are the three things. He said, I've done the first one. He saw a panda, then he went hunting for the Yeti, and was killed in an avalanche while hunting for the Yeti. But, again, it was that was in the 70s, it was that sort of time for it. But
Taken out by the Yeti himself.
that's it. Well, he claims he saw one before like he said he saw one from a distance. He was trying to get a closer look later on, a few years later, and was killed in an avalanche. No, he wouldn't be killed in an avalanche. He'd shout his way out.
No, I meant was the Yeti, bro.
Oh, it might have been. So I'll get back onto our questions because
sorry,
wax lyrical. Although I will add quickly that you mentioned his RP being ramped up. I mean, I used to go to America a fair bit, and I don't know if you found this over there, but I find as an English person, you naturally do it without realizing it over there, or you might just be more painfully aware of it.
Not sure. When I went over, I was speaking to someone on the bus, and they couldn't figure out where I came from. So they just presumed California. But I think that's like a sad generational decline of British accents that perhaps
in Oregon they thought I was from Australia. In Milwaukee, Illinois and in Wisconsin they knew I was British. But
are you not Australian?
New Zealand, mate. Stop ruining it.
Sorry, I keep getting them mixed up.
I sort of back onto it. The sort of we mentioned a bit about digging into the idea of like the poetics of something sort of seemingly as simple as a muddy track, and you sort of explained a bit by the poetic already of the poetics of it. But what overall to you makes that more than just a piece of potentially scientific evidence?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question, and I think that became sort of the anxiety of the dissertation. If I had a sense that there perhaps was something more than just a binary between hoax and fact, what was sort of leading me towards that? I suppose the idea that so many folk, particularly from the West, the US, have pledged their lives to this sort of thing, that we can even exhibit footprint casts in museums today, suggests that perhaps there's something else going on, which is really why I chose Sanderson, or one of the ways for why Sanderson became the figure that took up most of my time studying this past year for this dissertation, was that he seemed less bothered about seeming scientific, I suppose. He was not bothered at all about a scientific audience, let's say, by the later stages of his career, and became vulgar in discourse with them. He didn't really care if truth in its orthodox scientific stasis on his side. And I don't know whether that's just sort of his being cantankerous after having tried for years and years, along with Bernard Hooverman, to be accepted by the scientific folds, or whether he understood by that stage that there was perhaps something else going on. I think because we receive Bigfoot, the Yeti, and such like within stories, within narratives, there's always a call to perhaps something more mysterious than the binary between true and false, or fact and hoax. So I think I sort of trying to root out what perhaps that appeal is, why we like to read this sort of thing. If it's not just that we think it's true. I'm not 100% sold on it. I certainly wouldn't say that Bigfoot didn't exist. Looking across the expanse of the mountains near Willow Creek, it seemed more than plausible to me that there were places that no human being had ever travelled, hikes that were just simply impossible, places still uncovered, even in the US. So it certainly seemed more than possible that there might be a large being of Bigfoot's proportions still hidden up there. But whether or not I believe it's the real deal or not, there's still a fascination and something that gravitates audiences towards this kind of literature. Really, there's something so intoxicating about it, about this one last mystery for the human race to uncover. And it's that kind of framework, like you suggested earlier. If we've seen everywhere on Earth, where's next? People to read this kind of fiction, then I think it's something more than true or false. I think there's something deeply literary about it, intriguing, not just in a scientific way, but in the way you might. Is your mug a Marmite mug?
It's a Marmite mug, yeah. It's the weirdest thing
Full
on
of
the
Marmite.
show. No, funny enough, I mentioned going to the States. My ex-partner, she used to get me to bring jars of Marmite over for her because they got more Vegemite than Marmite. So I bought her a Marmite mug, and then she ended up leaving it here. So it's my
Disgusting.
Marmite mug now.
I couldn't even drink tea from that. That's just vile.
It's all right. I won't offer you one, and it's fine.
So yeah, your work makes a really interesting point about the 67 Patterson Gimlin film. And many people see that film as like the evidence for Bigfoot, but you suggest it actually scrambled or even like obscured the poetics.
Yeah, I think so.
So like
my argument was really that because the film is no longer an impression like a narrative might be, it's no longer a trace like a narrative or a footprint can be, but something that's actually like pointing towards the entity and suggesting that it itself is the entity, because you actually see real footage of a beast and it's trying to be much more than something left behind, let's say.
I see it like horror films, you know, like when you don't see the monster throughout the film and then once they reveal it, it's not scary anymore.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the right idea?
All of the suspense and the wonderful mystery is lost in frame 352 in my eyes. I
mean, I was chatting to Craig about this the other day, just sort of preparing for this interview and everything. I do massively agree with that in part, but I also wonder if it's also in terms of folklore, it evolves with the times, you know. So I wonder if that's also an inevitable evolution of that folklore, that mystery around Bigfoot. Is, you know, we are in an age like back then, sort of say back then as a very vague term, sort of back in like the early reports, like the 1800s, for example, where a footprint is there, that is nearly sort of clear enough proof that thing is there. You can see its footprint clearly. This massive creature that I don't know what it looks like, admittedly, has been here.
It's physical evidence.
Yeah, but once we get to an age where you do capture footage or sounds like the Sierra sounds, for example, you say that is our next jump in that. It's still not definitive proof, because instead of our minds saying we don't know what it looked like, now we're saying it could be fake or it could be not. But what if it's real? I don't know. Yeah, again, I'm like you in a sense that I do think it does kind of take away from it a little bit, and it removes that whole trace element of it and puts a physical aspect to it. But at the same time, is that just the next step in the evolution of the folklore and the mystery surrounding it?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful point, in that it's now being mediated to a sort of cinema audience, an audience that's being fed on visual narratives rather than written ones, maybe. And it's certainly, I don't know, that's something that's sort of been suggested, I think, in many of the things I'm read, and I'm sure you've read too. And I definitely think there's truth to that. I think what I was vying for is that if we're to understand a footprint as a trace, alongside the literary theorists that I brought in, then suddenly bringing forth an entity diminishes the mystery of Bigfoot and makes it all about whether it's true or false. But then, of course, we see in the sort of aftermath of the Patterson Gimlin film, whilst we still only speak in the language of it being true or false, it's still an enduring mystery, right? Still something that no one has managed to completely disprove, or no one's managed to completely prove, let's say. And it goes through sort of every 5 years as a kind of different understanding of the film, or we can see it in greater clarity now than perhaps even Patterson and Gimlin did when they saw this creature walking by Bluff Creek all those years ago now. With all the updates, I saw in January there's an AI tool that is able to pick up on the hair of the creature in each frame, so you can get these immaculately zoomed in images that look clear as day, far sharper than sort of the human eye, particularly when it's, I imagine, blurred in all the anticipation that those two had in following this creature. But for me, particularly looking from Sanderson's point of view, which was much of the aim of the dissertation, we see his efforts to speak about this creature in the way that he had in Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life is greatly diminished. So I definitely think you're right. There's two sides to this coin, right? One in which it no longer becomes something that could enliven Sanderson in the way that the mystery had even 5 years before the film was released. But for new viewers, younger audiences who had been taught how to understand narratives visually through film and television and such like, perhaps it became an even more expansive mystery. It's certainly the image that you think of when you think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, in our lifetime, it's always existed. We don't know what the world was before that footage, do we?
Mm.
Like, I don't know. Maybe... I don't know whether we're almost romanticizing the past of when.
But that's part of the beauty of it, though, isn't it? That's part of the cycle, is the romanticism of it, I think. I mean, you think like Harry and the Hendersons or anything like that, they are kind of all what you're saying, Craig. They are all based on that footage, aren't they? If you see a Bigfoot represented or sort of represented in cinema, it pretty much all harks back to that piece of footage.
Yeah.
Which is telling of like the authority of the visual image in this age. Like you said, Bigfoot was now being presented to new visual audiences in ways that it hadn't prior. And in the same way that it therefore becomes like a visual currency that can be used again and again and adapted. Like you said, it's still stuck in frame 352 in a way that it perhaps wasn't prior. Perhaps we can argue that there wasn't a set image of this mysterious creature in the years before 1967, before this film shot to the spotlight. And therefore, Bigfoot becomes less of a trace and more of a set image, more of an entity, as Derrida warns language might soon become, or warns against our reading of language as a set, concrete thing rather than a trace. Because it's now a set image, it's lost its flexibility. It's lost people adding in new bits, confirming their own experience of this creature as they tell their stories about him. It has to fit the Patterson Bigfoot. It's no longer about the story. I think perhaps that's what my dissertation is suggesting, though by no means is that suggesting that the film is not itself a wonderful piece, but I think perhaps slightly misguided.
I do remember actually chatting, I think it was on one of our earliest episodes, about when I was a child, like literally, sort of 7 or 8 years old, and thinking to myself, I hope they never find the Loch Ness monster in one way or another. I hope they never disprove it or prove it, because that would kind of kill. I loved it being a mystery, and I think a lot of people, this stuff is very much, they like it being a mystery. It goes back to that explorer thing, the final frontier of exploration on Earth. The idea that while there might be something out there, then there are still wild places in the world that we might not know about, and there's something I think thrilling, because like, there's something yet to be explored, to be discovered, you know.
Yeah, so you spent a lot of time looking at the Willow Creek China Flat Museum. As you mentioned, anyone's interested, we had Eric Nelson from the museum on previously. I believe it was episode 24, if anyone wants to have a listen to what Eric does at the museum and kind of his perspectives and some interesting sightings and stories that he gave us. Yeah, so from your perspective, Alex, like, why are those physical Bigfoot footprint casts and the community that collects and preserves them so significant to understanding the poetics that you talk about?
They became a really helpful image of how fragile the Bigfoot story, the narrative as a whole is. Let's say, if it's something that's lost its diversity, as the film has its spotlight and sort of takes over what we might imagine this creature to look like, then the cast themselves are a sort of fiction from a now dead age of Bigfoot discovery. Lots of them are originals, and some of them are copies of casts from the late 50s, from 58 particularly, with Jerry Crew, and all the way into the 70s and 80s. They tell of the very sort of land, the climate of Willow Creek, that unlike the Himalayas, it's capable of supporting that kind of manufacturing of casts. The mud doesn't just melt away like snow, let's say. So they both tell of a kind of specific culture that created these casts, so interested, so animated by Bigfoot all those years ago, that still persists, and yet they seem to be unintelligible to us now. At least there are still lots of people creating casts, but it very much seems like a kind of retro activity, people trying to bring alive again this intrinsically kind of Californian and Western United States activity. again, it still seems a mystery to me as to why this spoke very much to the poetry of the creature. I think it had something to do with its being rooted in the very environment of Willow Creek and surrounding areas, and not just the environment, but the people too. That it wasn't just two blokes, Patterson and Gimlin, taking footage of the creature by Bluff Creek, but it was a whole culture, hundreds of people searching for this creature, hundreds of readers active in making new stories as they found new footprints and cast them and shared them with their neighbours, with their families, all now collected and wonderfully preserved at the museum in Willow Creek. So I think it says something about how ingrained this kind of search for Bigfoot was in the late 50s to early 60s in this area, that it captured the imaginations of a subculture in the Western United States particularly, that was very much narrowed, I think, by the outbreak, let's say, of the film. I think probably that's my answer, that it says something about the ethnography of this creature, and that's why the cast are so helpful in trying to reimagine Bigfoot before the film.
So while primarily focused on what we call cryptids or cryptics, if Craig's saying it, sorry. Yeah, while primarily focused on what we call cryptids, Sanderson's interests famously extend into like even the stranger stuff, the phenomena like his work on UFOs or the concept of vile vortices, which is a wonderful term. We covered that on a recent episode on triangles. Did his approach to these more sort of unseen or non-physical phenomena have any bearing on how he thought about the elusive nature of footprints, which are, after all, physical but also ephemeral sort of traces?
Well, he uses those words precisely, I think, as he builds a theory of what the footprint is, that when we look at them, we might consider them as concrete, but actually these are things that pass away, that don't last for long, which I suppose is the problem that one would face if you come across a footprint of this sort of dimension. And it's a problem that the casts answer, because suddenly you can take this thing that seems concrete but really isn't, this thing that immediately evokes images of what must have left it there, now all becomes about the footprint as you cast it. I think the imaginative effort of making a cast is the belief that you can sort of bring the Bigfoot foot out of the ground, from its absence, from that place that was missing. You can now sort of build together pieces of this creature, which is wonderfully telling of what Sanderson is doing, I think, which I find quite beautiful, in that it's, as each story, his to introduce Abominable Snowman Legend Comes to life, he works through narratives from across the globe and tries to build a picture of this beast. And in the same way as one takes a cast on the ground, whether it's a handprint or a footprint or another part or supposed part of this creature's body, you're building a creature, which seems to be the event of narrative, that it's both recording something that's happened, true or otherwise, but also building what had happened. There's a reconstructive event happening in these narratives. So I find like this whole casting process, I talk about cast writing, Sanderson's cast writing, as something that's actually building the creature as it describes the creature. So the slow build up of images, which again appears to me dismissed more or less by the film, in that there's now one image rather than this mass culture of images that's brought together to understand this missing piece that's still left to be uncovered for us, the last great adventurers are lost in 1967 with the film.
Yeah, I like that, and I think I understand a little bit more now. You saying that, because while they're both the footage and a cast is taking the ephemeral and preserving it,
Mm.
whether in cast form or footage, that footage is that, as you say, that one piece, that one defining piece, as Craig mentioned, we all think back to, whereas casts, they can come from all over the place. They can be different shapes and sizes, and those collectors have stories to them. So yeah, I think I understand that a little bit more now. So thank you. Yeah, Craig.
Yeah. So yeah, beyond his direct investigations, what would you say is Sanderson's most enduring legacy or contribution to the field of cryptozoology? Kind of especially in how he encouraged us to read or understand the subtle signs of unknown creatures.
Hmm. I think it was certainly his encouragement of this mass making of casts that we see around the Willow Creek area in the 50s and early 60s. There are some wonderful newspaper clippings, both stored in the museum in Willow Creek, and also you can have a look up on the US's newspaper archives. There's lots on Sanderson, images of his visiting Willow Creek, touching the casts with locals there. He really invigorated that subculture to go on looking, and obviously made a lot of money out of it too. But still, in an area with at that time a dying log industry, Sanderson offered a kind of new currency through this Bigfoot phenomenon. And now we know a Willow Creek that is fed on tourism produced by this creature. I talked briefly about the McLaren sculpture that sits in Willow Creek, that's built on concrete. And the McLaren sculptured a large Bigfoot out of redwood. So you had this massive redwood stump, and he began to sculpt out the creature from it. I think in the same way, Sanderson is almost replacing or offering a route out of the depleting logging industry, out of the redwood, let's say, now to this new creature that can provide both a great sort of cultural appetite, but also an economic route out of what actually was economically rather disastrous. That the largest industry in the area, the logging industry, was falling into disrepair. Suddenly, Bigfoot stood where the stumps had been, and so wonderfully and poetically, it's on a slab of concrete, a very similar material to the plaster of Paris that's poured into each footprint as people find it. That now from concrete, from plaster of Paris, from these casts, Sanderson has nourished a culture, nourished an economy that continues on today, softer than it was in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s perhaps, but still very much alive.
So he was certainly not afraid to explore controversial ideas. From the research you've done, the reading you've done into it, did he have any particular unusual or perhaps sort of ahead of his time theories about the nature of cryptids that you come across, or even anomalies in general that might still surprise people today?
He was behind the release of new versions of scripture, particularly the books of Genesis. And there's this bit in, I've forgotten. I think it's Leviticus chapter 16, where what was once thought to be a goat is sacrificed. I think the Hebrew is something like Ceramus. And Sanderson is behind reading Ceramus as actually hairy ones. That in the account in Leviticus, we're actually reading a sort of narrative reimagination of Homo sapien outpeating other types of humans by sacrificing them in the temple. So I think probably the strangest, or read to me to be the strangest, was his scriptural revisions of the books of Genesis and Leviticus. Though I'll have to check that for you. Yeah, one of the drafts had bits of that in, trying to think about how Sanderson was reimagining footprints as not just a phenomenon of his time, but something that had walked alongside us humans, Homo sapien, since we could first remember, that they had always been there, and that they had been trampled out of English translations, reconsidered. So he was sort of offering a revival of scripture to include this mysterious creature. So I think that's probably seems to be the wackiest on the Bigfoot front, in my end. I'm by no means a Hebrew scholar, but I certainly don't think his was an orthodox reading of those lines of scripture. But what of Sanderson's was orthodox, and that's sort of
That's the point, yeah.
the
I mean, I quite like it. On one hand, yeah, absolutely wacky. On the other hand, I've always quite liked the idea that some of the Bible and other religious texts from all over the world are sort of, some of it comes from this folk memory of earlier times. It's why you get floods popping up in like Gilgamesh, the Bible, or various other stories. I think I've always liked the idea that some of that is harking back to folk memory. So you never know, maybe he was onto something.
that makes me. Yeah, I certainly like the idea that for him, Bigfoot sort of forms an essential part of the human imaginary.
Yeah.
In the same way that Papsy's memories of floods might do. Yeah. Funny guy. Love him.
So researching a historical figure like Sanderson for a thesis, I'm assuming, involved some unique challenges and discoveries. So what are kind of the most surprising or perhaps difficult aspects of your research? I mean, have you uncovered any kind of unique archival materials or sources that maybe shed new light on his life or his work?
Oh, there really wasn't much online, which led me to visit the US. And I was very generously funded by my university to head over. So I felt very grown up.
Nice.
That was real fun. Looking through the extensive archives at the Willow Creek Museum was a real help. In terms of what I found that was maybe most surprising about him in my research, probably came from an archive that is in fact digital and free for everyone to look up on the American Philosophical Society's website. You'd find the Ivan T. Sanderson papers, and there's a warrant out for him. The warrant is that sort of the style of the form is that his dog has bitten someone, but they don't quite have a form that fits what actually happened, because they've crossed out dog at each occurrence with monkey. Sanderson at one point had in his midst a tame, or perhaps not particularly tame, monkey that he was looking after as a pet. They had bitten a poor woman as he was taking it out for a walk one morning. That was probably the most surprising bit of Sanderson writing that I found. There's also a letter from Sanderson to his wife, detailing how she's best to look after. I think it's the armadillo that he's taken back from a trip to Costa Rica. There are lots of quite marvelous things written between me and his wife that are certainly beyond my imagination, and certainly draw a picture of the man who was kind of a jack of all trades, looking after a monkey and an armadillo, though perhaps not particularly well, if the monkey hit a lady on the street as she walked by. Poor thing. So no, they were certainly the strangest things. But and they certainly build the image of a very lively personality, and one that we find indeed at the center of this story. in the 60s.
So after, and we sort of touched on this briefly already, but after immersing yourself so deeply in Sanderson's world and life and the rigorous study of cryptids and their traces, where do you personally stand? If you had to sort of give a quick answer, or not so quick, it's up to you, um, on the existence of these unproven animals, not just Bigfoot, but all across the board, do you consider yourself a believer, leaning more skeptic, or somewhere in between? And if you could tell us why.
Maybe annoyingly to your question, I think one of the purposes in my reading was to get slightly further away from discussions of true or false, and lean more into what's so beautifully literary about this. My sense is that these stories still have a wonderful value to them, even if they're absolute gobbledygook. And if they're wonderfully true, they still have a really gorgeous narrative quality that I think is more or less deserving of academic study. I don't think, particularly, we see this with Sanderson. He's so bothered at some point, let's say, particularly towards the end of Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life, so bothered that we believe it ourselves, but he's bothered that we've read it. And he thinks that there's a beauty in lots of what he's uncovered narratively as he travels from place to place and corresponds with folk who say that they've seen a creature like this, like Bigfoot, like the Yeti, from all across the world. He very much wants these stories to be out there, and think that there's something deeply important about it. He knows by the end that he can't himself prove it or can't himself change our minds, but he wants to put it for us. So I definitely think it's important to consider whether these creatures are out there. As I said earlier, I think it's certainly more than possible. I think I'm probably part of the majority in saying that Bigfoot seems more probable, let's say, than the Loch Ness Monster. It existing in such a broad stretch of land, let's say, and being recognized by folk from all across the globe. It has a global appeal that maybe the Loch Ness Monster doesn't quite so much. And if it's not true, then there's something all the more complicated about why it seems to be a persistent image in the way that we tell stories to each other, why we're so fascinated by this human-like creature, quite a lot taller, quite a lot broader, that creeps on the edges of our towns, cities, our villages.
Yeah. I was just going to say a bit more sort of that untamed wild version of ourselves, maybe, you know?
Yeah, something like that. Perhaps there's something with Sanderson's retranslation of accounts of Nephilim in Genesis or the hairy ones in Leviticus, that there's always been something walking beside us here. Perhaps, like you say, this untamed, perhaps sort of teaching against leaving or crossing the boundaries and regulations of our societies, an image of what goes wrong when we stray away from the domestic, let's say, or perhaps, I don't know, an image of our hunter-gatherer past, let's say, that history is alive today in these stories about Bigfoot or the Yeti or whatever you might call him or her. That there's still something creeping behind and reminding us of our primitive roots. That was the interest of lots of my study, rather than it being true or false. But no, I certainly think it's possible. It seems all the more unlikely to me that it's nothing at all, if that's more satisfying.
I get that. I mean, you sort of, and that's what I quite like about what you're doing. It's not just straddling the sort of cryptozoology and the sort of the English, the literature side of it, but also touching on the anthropological side of it as well, which I think is a very fascinating reflection on ourselves.
Hmm. I mean, from like your academic perspective, like why do you think it's important to preserve Sanderson's legacy and sort of continue to research the unknown?
Hmm. Um, I think part of my desire to study this in such depth was that it's really unread, and it seemed remarkable that it's lots of the writing, particularly that of Sanderson, is asking very similar questions to contemporary literary theory. Like I began this podcast with. Thank you again for having me on.
You're welcome.
And it seems to me that because it's asking all these similar questions, that perhaps the work of the literary theorists of the 60s that is deemed to be so against the culture of their time or so forward thinking is actually part of a mass movement towards the trace, towards investigating something like Bigfoot prints or the traces, let's say, that we're to imagine language by in Derrida's understanding. That it sort of helps reframe these great literary theories as actually working as part of a subculture that is moving real and not just part of the, let's say, I don't know, upper echelons of the academic world, but happening in the mud and the dirt of Northern California. That it's not just something in the kind of working out in the great minds of the mid-century, but an interest that we can see and pinpoint it as every strata of society. So I think Bigfoot helpfully kind of removes an idea that these thinkers that my literary study are so formed by, like I said earlier, Barth and Derrida, perhaps aren't, let's say, the renegades that we might imagine them to be, but form part of this this broader movement investigating the trace wherever we might find it. So I think it helpfully brings thinkers like that down to earth, whether that's mud in California or the snowy peaks of the Himalaya. So I think that was part of my purpose. And from then on, from that kind of original seed, I kept going and kept on finding more and more links that were helpful for my study.
So I have like a just for fun question that I wanted to ask you, kind of as part of rounding up, right? So I wondered whether there's a cryptid that you'd prefer genuinely didn't exist, one that you hope does exist, and also maybe if you could have one as a pet or a companion, which one would it be?
Ooh.
Bigfoot for all three.
Kind of works.
Think because all of the Bigfoot stories or all of the big feet that have been described in the narratives I've looked at are all so diverse, it might well be all three. That there are some that seem really sweet, some really dangerous, some you really wouldn't want around, and some that would be certainly fascinating in terms of scientific study. Though I'm sure that's true for all of them. So I certainly think Bigfoot for all three is more than a valid answer. In a sort of pre-1967 Patterson Gimlin world, let's say. But since we're living post that, I probably would very much like Bigfoot to be around. I think, like I said, that would be a fascinating study, but I certainly wouldn't want him anywhere near me. As a pet, did you ever hear about the giant penguins?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd quite like them.
Yeah.
Maybe not so close, just in the garden in a paddock. Well,
15-foot tall penguins.
And what was the other one?
One you hope doesn't exist.
Ooh, I'm not sure. I couldn't say that.
Too negative.
That would be cruel.
I mean, we joking about three for sort of all three for the same one. sort of being Bigfoot. There's an author called Max Brooks.
Mm.
He wrote World War Z and the Zombie Survival Guide. He's a son of Mel Brooks. Because for a little while when he did World War Z and the Zombie Survival Guide, we were like trying to figure, me and my mates were trying to figure out whether he was a comedic genius or someone that was just hiding in a bunker waiting for the zombies to come. But then we found out he was Mel Brooks' son, so that sort of answered that one. But he did a book a few years back called Devolution. And that is sort of a horror based on this sort of eco self-sustaining commune in the middle of the forest that essentially ends up getting attacked and pretty much destroyed, spoilers, by these sort of these Bigfoot creatures, and are sort of exploring their sort of the war with nature and nature pushing back. And these things are pretty terrifying. Like I don't scare too easily with these sort of things, but listening to that, because I torture myself with this. I was listening to it on audiobook, walking through the woods at night, and it did make me feel uneasy. You know, it's like I'm not in my natural environment anymore. You know, so I think potentially, like, that sort of that aspect of Bigfoot. Because when we were chatting to Maxim yesterday, he was talking about as a protector of nature, a guardian of nature, and that I guess can go both ways. You know.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. There's certainly a striking, terrifying version, and one that's seeking to protect the world from human chartering. Yeah, there's Blake Bigfoot, I think.
Yeah.
A romantic Bigfoot that's protecting the world.
Real quick, actually, just wanted to ask if we got time as well before we round it up. Did you speak to many people sort of traveling over there, going to the Willow Creek? Because I know Eric's always played it really close to his chest with us, it's which is, I think, a good thing for him to do. But he was saying that he gets a lot of people coming in with Bigfoot stories, some of which you wouldn't normally be like that, some of which are very, what he'd describe as grounded people. Did you speak to many people over there when you were over there, or just in your studies, like talking to people, researching, that really genuinely believed it?
I didn't have the opportunity to speak to those who had seen the creature themselves at Willow Creek. But when I went to a place called Boring, just outside of Portland, Oregon, where there's another museum headed up by Cliff Barackman, there were many there who had seen this creature and had for themselves stories of its majesty. I think Eric talks quite beautifully about this being a sort of deeply emotional experience. People, that there have been sort of tears in men's eyes if they've spoken to him about what they've seen. But there's something deeply quite spiritual about this creature. For lots of those who've encountered it, there's a real miracle in their line of view, that they've come across this wild, beautiful image of nature in a world that seems so set on conquering the natural world, let's say. And I suppose we see that in Sanderson's desire to keep adventuring and having all of these exotic animals left at home with him. We see something of that great British conqueror still living in him. And Bigfoot escapes him. It's something he can't prove, can't capture, can't himself. Something that's beyond his view. Something that continues to frustrate and complicate his ideas of the real. So it's lost somewhere, I think, in the imagination of these folk as they look out into the wild, that there might be this creature out there. There's some really beautiful kind of normal poetry about Bigfoot, let's say, as this guardian of the wild that persists despite our human attempts to conquer it. Some are bigger, smarter than us, can elude us like that, and yet is ever leaving traces.
I like that, and that is the poetry of it. That is the beauty of it. And I've never been to Willow Creek, but having been around sort of Portland and Oregon, sort of Mount Hood, the wilderness there, you can certainly believe it as well. You know, you can certainly feel that there. We had one last thing to do, and again, it's a bit of a fun one, and we tend to do it with guests, if you're cool with it. We have a feature we do. It's, as I'm sure you're aware, the news is often filled with slightly mad headlines, starting with Florida Man. So we've got a little segment where we like to take a guest's date of birth, not the year, just the month and the day, and read their Florida Man story. So if you'd be willing to give us the day and the month of your birth, would you like to know your Florida Man story?
9th of December.
Let me see.
Whilst he's looking up the story, I'll ask you actually, Alex. So when you were researching, and obviously you went to the States, did you look into any of the UK Bigfoot sightings?
I didn't. Though I've heard you two talk about them on this show.
There's a fair few,
yeah.
Considering the size of this little island. I was quite surprised how often it comes up on places like Salisbury Plain.
It seems all the more less believable here.
Yeah.
So I'm certainly open to it. No, I haven't come across it myself. No, I think there are some stories quite local to me. But there's lots of folklore on this little island, hey?
I think last year there was a news story of someone that was out fishing or something in the night and saw one on like the Sussex Downs, maybe.
Huh.
And there was another one somewhere, it might have been Cornwall or Devon, where they found some footprints kind of.
Florida man beats ATM machine, says it gave too much cash.
There you go, he's found his own.
You found your own one. So I found a different one. So I like your one. My different search engine, I guess. My one is a Florida man was arrested after he tried smuggling live birds in his pants. US Customs and Border Protection agents said he concealed 6 exotic birds. Sounds like something Ivan T. Sanderson might do.
Yeah, these things. Are they like forest?
Yeah. 6 exotic birds in a fanny pack and 3 more in his groin area. Agents arrested him in Miami International Airport after he got off on January the 9th, after he got off a flight from Cuba to Florida. It is a violation of federal law to smuggle live animals in the US. And that's it. Nice short one, but there you go. And also
Did
beating
you
an
not just say
ATM.
January 9th, though?
No. Hang on. Where's that?
I'm sure you just said January 9th.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you said December. I don't know why that came up.
It should be December. So that's not your Florida man story.
Oh, no. It came out. I'm guessing the trial took a while to do because this was done. The article came out in December.
Okay,
we'll let you off.
So there you go.
Well, thank you. I'll live life differently.
Now you know. I guess just if you're ever going to go and smuggle animals, don't do it in Florida.
Yeah.
Or you could be your own Florida man story. That could be quite unique. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been good fun.
Yeah, we as you can probably tell, we could probably wax lyrical about this for ages, and we neither of us are very sort of academically inclined, so sort of a little bit different from us in a sense, sort of going off of a dissertation, but that was really interesting.
Me. So thank you for your questions. Thank you for being so thoughtful.
That's all right. Thank you for coming on the show. And quick, again, we'll mention thanks to Eric Nelson at the Bigfoot Museum, because he's the one who suggested that you might come on the podcast and be a good guest based on your dissertation. Because I don't think we mentioned earlier, you actually sent it to the museum, didn't you? As have they put it on display? I think you requested they did, or said they could.
Now part of their archive, which is
okay.
Yeah,
that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a Stevenson Alexander file somewhere in Northern California.
It's a good claim to fame.
I think so.
Yeah.
One I'm certainly chuffed with.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that's about it from us, I guess. Anything else, Craig?
No. I suppose I quickly bore everyone with the social media plug. So we're on wyrdwessex.co.uk, where you can follow the podcast, get email notifications when we release new content. And you can sign up. It is free, but you can sign up and give us a couple of quid a month to help with the running costs. Or you can follow us anywhere on social media at Wyrd Wessex. And same on YouTube.
And yeah, that's about it. So thanks for joining us, everyone. And until next time, stay weird.